Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
Hello and welcome to Invest Africa. I'm Nozi Pombanjwas. Now, Africa's place in the international trading system has often been simplified to a simple statistics: less than 2% of international trade. Now, the World Trade Organization's 10th Ministerial Conference, held in Nairobi in December of last year, convened with the intent to lower trade costs, to generate more trade, and of course to generate more investment globally. In today's show, we will be revisiting Africa's progress in international trade, and we're going to be doing that with the help of my guest. We will be joined from Nigeria by Temitope Oshikoya, and he's the CEO of Nextnomics, and he'll be joining us from our Lagos studios. Back here in Johannesburg, we're going to be joined by Dr. Philani Mthembu. He's a senior researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue, and of course, Catherine Grant Makokera. She's an independent researcher with Tutwa Consulting. Now, before we get into the conversation, I started off this conversation by speaking to Lambert Botha. He's a director at Hilton Lambert Practitioners of Trade Law, to unpack the legal frameworks of international trade, and particularly for him to share with us what the outcomes of this meeting that was held in Nairobi were and what these meant for Africa.
You must recall that under the Uruguay round that established the WTO from the GATT, we went the single undertaking route to say everything is agreed, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. Okay, so you can't nitpick agreements. I like the agreement on agriculture, I don't like the dumping agreement. If you sign up to all, or you stay out. Now that worked for the Uruguay round, and that's been carried through to the Doha development round as well. But now we sit with, I think, in excess of 163 countries, 161 going into the Nairobi conference, with diverse economic status and pressure on the system. So some countries wants to move on to other issues, as I said, maybe digital trading, trade in environmental goods, higher level of trade in services commitments than what we currently have under the GATS agreement, the General Agreement on Tariffs on Trade in Services under the WTO. So the one way is to say, okay, if we can't do it within the WTO multilateral context where everyone signs up through consensus and all 163 members are party to that agreement, well, let's do it plurilaterally. Now, there are examples already in the WTO of plurilateral agreements. It's not a new thing. The Civil Aircrafts Agreement is a plurilateral agreement. Not every, the Government Procurement Agreement is a plurilateral agreement. But but now they've decided, well, maybe we should take some of these issues that we can't get movement on in the WTO. Let's take them on a plurilateral. So there you've got a pressure on the system. What do we make of that? African countries typically said that we should do in the WTO. We should negotiate within the WTO multilateral agreements. And if you look at the ministerial declaration that was signed at the conclusion of the ministerial conference, now in 19th of December, you would find that they recognize, all members still, the WTO as the forum for multilateral negotiations. But that does not mean necessarily, in at least my reading, that that's the only place to negotiate trade, is WTO. So you will find that they negotiate trade now under regional, as we've done, South Africa and many other African countries. All the groupings, ECOWAS, COMESA, EAC, SACU, SADC, is all configurations of regional trade negotiations going on, or bilateral, like we have with the EU. But then now we see the emergence of mega regionals, the Trans-Pacific and the Transatlantic, where a lot of merchandise trade is going to be covered. Some people say 70–80% of merchandise trade and goods is going to be covered by those mega regionals. So how does that impact upon the WTO as we know it, as the forum for multilateral trade negotiations? Because that's still recognized. The other issue is consensus-based decisions has been recognized. So it seems that there is still some support for single undertaking. But for the African group, maybe if I just move on to what happened, there were basically 6 ministerial decisions, and there was a great movement on the abolishment of agricultural export subsidies, which is a distortive subsidy, distorting the world price on agricultural commodities. So that's great movement, immediate abolishment, and for developing countries, some leeway, and for least developed countries and net food importing countries, even a bit longer time to abolish export subsidies. But so on export subsidies was a thing that was coming on from at least 2005, the Hong Kong Ministerial. So that's great. I think that's everyone is glad that has come to as a firm commitment. And then there was on public stockholding of food. For staple food. That was a decision taken to say we need to find a permanent solution on public stockholding, because it could constitute members exceeding their subsidy commitments that they, countries made subsidy commitments up to a certain level, and the argument is that public stockholding could exceed and allow them to violate some of their commitments under subsidies. And so the decision was taken, well, by 2017 we need to find, when the next ministerial meeting is coming up, we need to work towards a permanent solution.
And perhaps just as a final comment, if you could give us a sense of how should Africa benefit from international trade? Because if we look at the numbers, it certainly seems that we are there in representation, we are there in terms of signing the treaties, but are we benefiting from international trade?
Yeah, I think the issue is, we're there when the signing takes place, or we're there when the rules are formulated. So that is itself so capacity needs to be emphasized, and from the idea that I'm toying with is how can we integrate our research institutions, our universities, our master students. We haven't got the luxury in Africa to bypass those institutions of knowledge. Maybe a country needs to establish what they want from the trade agenda. Maybe speak to the universities to create capacity in their curriculum, in the theses, topics for thesis. I'm very practical now, how to build capacity and an awareness, because today's students are tomorrow's negotiators, right? So to be au fait with those trade topics. Secondly, I would say that we need to look at the level of organization within business, so that you've got platforms within business, organized chemical industry, or organized with a representative body, which is not always present. We take it for granted sometimes, but it's not, to create platforms for government to speak and business to speak with one voice. In order to formulate these positions.
So we've heard from the international trade perspective, from a legal perspective. Let's bring it back into studio now. Catherine, if I were to say to you, is Africa benefiting from international trade? Would you concur with Lambert that there's still more to be done?
Oh, absolutely. There's always more to be done. I do believe that overall Africa does benefit from its engagement in world trade. Quite frankly, it's a bit of a moot point, really, because it's hard not to these days. We live in a highly globalized environment, and even if you're not trading in goods, you may be trading in services, you may be indulging in electronic commerce, of course, which is going to be the theme of the World Economic Forum in Davos this year.
And of course, there's the negative side of the coin, Catherine, where, being a part of the international trade system also does have some certain extent harmful effects on your own markets. Are we finding that balance, and are we getting it right?
To find the balance, you have to really look at what your national priorities are first. And I think that's something we often don't do, especially when we go off to these large conferences like the Ministerial Conference of the WTO. You need to go there very strongly prepared to defend your own national development concerns. Sometimes I wonder whether in African countries, and countries including South Africa, we do enough preparation, if you like, to truly understand what it is we want to get out of those negotiations and how we're best going to do that. I mean, this is a gathering of hundreds, thousands of people. You have to have a very clear strategy if you're going to make the most of those few days.
And I'm going to come come to you in that moment because there's a lot of conversation around the preparation and whether we should be going in as blocks or as individual countries. But before I do that, Philani, what are the burning issues for Africa in the international trade system? What are the things that are likely to be shaping the conversation even at the World Economic Forum that kicks off on Wednesday?
Well, first of all, we come back, of course, from the 10th Ministerial. Now, that comes within the larger backdrop of the Doha Development Agenda. The issues that remain burning issues are issues that have been consistently raised by developing countries within the realm of the Doha Development Agenda. And those you can link also with the Sustainable Development Goals. African countries are trying to industrialize at the moment. There's a misconception that Africa is not well integrated into the global economy. We are integrated. It's just the way in which we integrated. We're selling raw materials for very cheap prices, for prices that we cannot even determine. And what we are trying to do as African countries is to move up that value chain and to better define our terms of trade. And that's really where the challenge comes. Whether African countries can really make that transition from, exporting purely their raw materials to actually developing industries within the different regional blocks, but also within individual countries. And that will determine, I think, moving forward, our terms of trade.
Is the WTO still the best mechanism, and the Doha development conversation still the best mechanisms to do exactly what Philani says, to try and move up the value chain? Or should we be looking at other architects and other frameworks to have these conversations?
I think the WTO has only ever been one of a selection of engagements that you should take if you're going to look at your trade policy, your industrial policy, and what that means for development. And I think sometimes we tend to load a lot onto the WTO that it's not in fact designed to do. The WTO is in fact a fairly limited structure. We've seen the limitations of what it can achieve, and particularly in the last few years since the Doha negotiations have been ongoing. I think in terms of Africa's agenda, we are much better placed putting our energy into things like regional economic integration, which is also a key priority for the continent. And we are seeing some steps forward to create free trade areas more broadly, to make sure that we link with our neighbours in more effective ways, and to bring down the costs that are there, so that we can become part of value chains. You can't really add value if, for example, you have no access to energy on a consistent basis. If your costs of transport are prohibitively high and you can't get the inputs you need from one side of your country to the other, those things are really where I think I'd want to see a concentrated effort.
So there's certainly issues where there needs to be a more concentrated effort. We're going to get into those issues in a short while. Let's take a break here in Johannesburg. When we come back, we pick up on these in the conversation. Welcome back to Invest Africa. As promised, we're now joined by Temitope Oshikoya. He is the CEO of Nextnomics, and he joins us from our studios in Nigeria. And he joins us, of course, with our Johannesburg guests as well. Temitope, thank you for making time to be a part of this conversation. Just give us a sense in terms of your perspective of whether Africa has done the best that it can within the international trade system to reap the benefits that its markets need in order to flourish.
Well, I think when you look at some key indicators, I don't think we've done very well. I think we've done quite a bit, but we haven't done that very well. If you look at Africa, account for almost more than 10% of the global population, but its contribution to global exports is about 3.5%. So from that perspective, I think our exports as a percentage of total global export is still very minimal. And we can do more within the framework of the WTO. We can do more to reduce transaction costs. We can do more to increase the productivity of our tradables. And we can do more in terms of adding value to our export producers.
Of course, a lot of us, there's a lot of options, solutions and policy options that you're putting on the table, Temitope. But if we were to look at priorities for Africa, especially in light of the fact that the World Economic Forum is also kicking off, there will be a focus on some of these conversations. Are we able to pinpoint the top 3 things that Africa should be focusing on if we are to improve the terms of trade in our favor?
There are tariff barriers as well as non-tariff barriers. I think in terms of the macroeconomic framework, African countries have done quite a bit over the last decade. In terms of tariff barriers, they've also tried to bring down trade tariffs. However, non-tariff barriers continue to constitute a drag on productivity. Logistics, for example, it costs more to ship goods from Lagos to Dakar than it costs from Lagos to London by sea. So when you also look at it, 15 out of 54 African countries are landlocked countries, and therefore the infrastructure cost of moving goods from their hinterland, so the nearest port, is also very high. So I think that interconnect activity in terms of infrastructure, in terms of railway, in terms of road across African countries is extremely very important. Secondly, or if I can say thirdly, is that we need to continue to explore export processing zone. And in this regard, some countries have established export processing zones, but I think more still can be done, especially in terms of manufacturing export. If you look at Africa's export in manufacturing, only 4 countries actually dominate it. They constitute close to 2/3 of Africa's manufacturing export: South Africa, Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt. If you strip out those middle-income countries, you realize that the next set of countries are far below in terms of manufacturing export. So without plugging into manufacturing export, without plugging into the global value chain, I think we will continue to lag in terms of exports. Thank you.
Thank you for that contribution, because Catherine, I want to link what Temitope is saying to one of your earlier comments around regional integration. And we've seen quite a lot of efforts in terms of trying to get that right on the African continent. Is it helping our position in the international trade system, though?
No, it's not actually right now, because what we've tended to do is very much focus on the basic issues amongst ourselves, like bringing down tariffs and so on. But when it comes to forming a cohesive common trade policy that you would need to engage as a group, that's where we tend to have challenges, because that requires giving up some of your sovereignty over your decision-making processes. Trade is usually just one of a tool within a whole set of economic issues related to things like industrialization, as we've heard. And that's when you start to see competition coming up, quite frankly, among African countries. So far we haven't really seen many of the African economic blocs negotiating together. Probably the East African Community is the one exception, but even the Southern African Customs Union grouping doesn't tend to negotiate as a group in the World Trade Organization context.
But Philani, if we take the European Union as perhaps just one of the models that could be looked at, and we maybe compare that with the Africa group that does exist, although very loosely, because it doesn't have those legal holdings, is that what we need? Do we need the formalization of a model like the European Union for us to have a coordinated voice when we go into these engagements?
We can't exactly copy the European Union. It was formed for completely different reasons under a different context when compared to the African Union. You'd have to, I think, look into the sub-regions of the continent, and that's really where most of the work has to be going in. If you look at an example like Mercosur, for instance, you have Brazil, which is playing a very key role there and has understood that it will have to make a lot of concessions in order to get countries such as Argentina and Uruguay to actually follow in its lead there. It also has a smaller mandate, so its mandate is really largely towards issues of trade. Whereas if you look at our regional economic blocs, we have a huge mandate. We have issues of security, we have issues of trade, of course, you have a lot of political issues there. I would actually say these regional economic blocs are taking on too much at the same time.
And I mean, you've raised the issue of industrialization, and I'll bring this question back in because it ties in nicely with the big theme around the World Economic Forum now. But before we do that, let's go back to Nigeria. Temitope, one of the issues that's also arising is that there's a lot of agreements between, we'll call them bilateral agreements or unilateral agreements between states that fall outside of the WTO agreement and framework. Are these on the increase? Can you give us a sense of whether increasingly markets are trying to find agreements that fall out of the WTO mechanism? And if that's the case, does this pose a risk for the credibility of what's been discussed thus far around developing countries and the WTO?
Yes, I think the WTO remains an important international organization which provides a forum for discussions on trade agreement. However, since the collapse of the Doha discussion on trade agreement, I think countries have focused more on bilateral and regional trade agreement. We saw the way the US led to the recent TIPS agreement, Transatlantic Pacific Trade Agreement. And we also see the way China is also moving, not only in terms of trade agreement, but also in terms of multilateral development institutions, such as the New Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Bank, which was actually which opened for business, I think, earlier this week. So there is more and more bilateral and regional trade agreement. But even the one that exists, currently exists, like AGOA, I think African countries can make better use of those bilateral and regional trade agreements by even trying to produce to meet the standards for those agreements. I agree with the earlier commentator in terms of the regional blocks within Africa. To some extent, there needs to be some kind of priorities. And one of the things you realize is that they've been able to do well when it comes to functional achievement in the sense of, for example, labor mobility. In West Africa, for example, you have a unique passport among ECOWAS citizens. And another area which they've done very well, which goes beyond trade, is in terms of health issues. How, for example, Ebola was essentially dealt with in a regional basis. But overall, I think the key issue for African countries is that first, most of them seems to produce the same thing or similar product. And secondly, the productivity involved in producing those similar products are quite low compared to in developed countries. So they need to raise their own productivity. Yes.
Your analysis and insight is fantastic, and unfortunately we're running out of time, so I just want to get final comments from Johannesburg before we wrap. Catherine, I'd like you to just comment on the industrialization conversation. The big focus is on the fourth industrialization revolution in the world at the World Economic Forum. How does Africa take this forward? And of course, Dr. Philani, if you could just come up with, what do you think South Africa's role in advancing Africa's participation in international trade could possibly be? Let's start with you, Catherine.
Thanks. I mean, I agree. Industrialization is critical. A trade agreement is only as useful if you're actually making things competitively, as our guest in Nigeria was saying. What's interesting about the WEF theme around the fourth industrialization agenda is that really I feel that Africa's narrative is still stuck a few back. We tend to think about industrialization in terms of manufacturing,
yes,
whereas what we're talking about now at a global level is industrialization about services, about the electronic commerce space.
Yes.
We need to get there.
We need to get with the program. You've got 10 seconds, Philani.
South Africa has, I think, the capacity to assist other countries in terms of understanding the increasingly complex global trading landscape. And I think in the immediate term where South Africa can assist is in terms of coordinating our positions. And in order to do that, South Africa has to know that it has to give up something also in order for other countries to follow behind its leadership.
And it seems as if the key word that keeps coming up is giving up something, sacrificing for the collective. And of course, this is where we end our conversation. We've just scratched the surface, but nonetheless, a very big thank you to my guest, Temitope Oshikoya, CEO of Nextnomics, who joined us from Nigeria, Dr. Philani Mthembu, Senior Researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue, and of course, Catherine Grant Makokera, Independent Researcher with Tutwa Consulting. Thank you for joining me. And of course, we started off the conversation by speaking to Lambert Botha. He's a director at Hilton Lambert Practitioners of Trade Law. Thank you so much for joining us. For you at home, if you want to be a part of these conversations, just let us know. This is at CNBC Africa, and of course, follow me at The Real Nosy. Until next time, it's goodbye.
Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG. Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.